Hello and welcome to my channel, where I'll be telling you all kinds of strange stories, ranging from true crime to some much less believable, although just as fascinating, tales. For today's video we have the devastating story of Rosemary Kennedy. Listen in and see what you think. When you think of the Kennedys, you probably think of glamour and power. You'll think of fashion and politics. You'll think of the 22nd of November 1963 and the tragic events that took place when John F. Kennedy was shot, and that might remind you of the family's other deaths. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., brother to JFK, died as a pilot in World War II in 1944 at the age of 28. Kathleen Kick Kennedy, JFK's sister, died at 28 in 1948 in a plane crash. John F. Kennedy Jr., JFK's son, died in 1999 along with his wife Carolyn and her sister Lauren Bassett when his light aircraft crashed in Martha's Vineyard. And of course, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1968, and the list goes on. Anyone would think the Kennedy family had a curse. One name you might not see mentioned too often, if at all, is Rosemary. Rosemary Kennedy is another Kennedy family sibling, sister to Joe Jr., John and Bobby, and her tale is perhaps the most tragic of all. Born on the 13th of September 1918, Rosemary, or Rosemary as she was originally called, was Joseph P. Kennedy and Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald's third child. She was their first daughter. When Rosemary was born, the Spanish flu epidemic was running rampant throughout the world, and it would eventually kill between 20 and 50 million people. At the time of Rosemary's birth, the Kennedys lived in the town of Brookline in Massachusetts, and there was a huge increase in deaths from the Spanish flu in this area at that time. What has this got to do with Rosemary? Timing. Because so many people were ill with influenza, it meant that Rose's doctor was unavailable when she went into labour with Rosemary. Scared, without a doctor to help her, Rose tried to delay the birth, something the nurse who was actually present had advised her to do. Sadly, this advice and the action taken because of it would go on to have tragic consequences. The nurse ordered Rose to squeeze her legs tightly together to delay the birth, and when that didn't work, she actually pushed the head back when it started to protrude. This went on for 2 agonising hours. As you might imagine, this was not good for Rose Fitzgerald, and it was certainly not good for tiny Rosemary Kennedy. It meant that the baby was deprived of oxygen, and when she was finally born, she was irrevocably brain damaged. Of course, this was not known at the time. When the doctor arrived, the baby was delivered and the doctor declared her to be healthy. However, as much as the Kennedys tried to ignore the signs, as their first daughter started to grow older, it was clear that something was amiss. It took her much longer than her siblings, and other babies her age come to that, to crawl, walk, and speak. And although every child goes at their own pace, Rosemary's was a pace that caused some concern. In order to get a diagnosis and to help their daughter, Joseph and Rose approached a number of specialists. Each one told the same story. Rosemary's condition was a result of oxygen deprivation at birth. So with this news, and knowing there was nothing to be done for little Rosemary, what did this powerful, wealthy, influential family do? They hid her. They made sure she was kept away from the world. And why did they do this? Out of shame. They couldn't let anyone know that any Kennedy had anything wrong with them, especially a brain condition. Can you imagine how their reputation would suffer? No, she had to be hidden so they could remain the all-American great political powerhouse they were. No question about it. This sounds bad, doesn't it? And it undoubtedly is. However, it gets worse. The Kennedys were avid churchgoers, and at this time the Catholic Church denied disabled people communion and confirmation. That that meant Rosemary was denied communion and confirmation. This was due to a long-held belief that anyone with a learning disability or mental disability of any kind was possessed by a demon. And yet the Kennedys kept going to church, kept doing what the priest told them, and hid their daughter away. Rosemary was sent to a number of different boarding schools, which made it a lot easier for the Kennedys to pretend she didn't exist, or so you might think. The strange thing was, although they were hiding her from the public gaze, and although they were, without a doubt, ashamed of her condition, and perhaps even thought she might be possessed, or at least they didn't rail against the idea, they did, by all accounts, love their daughter. They did all they could to involve her in family gatherings and events, and they tried their best to love her. If you read Rosemary's diary she wrote as a teenager, you'll see that she spent many a happy day with her family, having fun and attending dances and concerts. However, although Rosemary was involved, it wasn't easy for her to participate at all times. The Kennedy siblings were a hugely competitive bunch, always trying to one-up each other, always trying to be the best. Rosemary simply couldn't keep up. The girl began to grow frustrated, feeling that she couldn't live up to her parents' high expectations. The main problem was that her parents actually thought they could cure their daughter's brain damage if they held her to the same standards as her overachieving siblings, and so the situation grew worse and worse, with frustration and disappointment being the two main emotions at play. In the end, this was all for nothing, as you might expect. Rosemary's intellectual capabilities never progressed beyond a year 6 or 5th grade level. In other words, she had the mental age of a 10-year-old. In 1938, when she was 19, Rosemary's father Joe was awarded the position of United States Ambassador to the United Kingdom, and the entire Kennedy clan moved to London. Rosemary thrived in London. She was enrolled in a convent school that ran a Montessori program, and she loved it. And the press loved her, and why not? She was beautiful, rich and charming. In May 1938, she and her younger sister Kathleen, known as Kick, were presented to George VI and Queen Elizabeth. The newspapers were plastered with photos of the smiling Kennedy girls and their mother Rose. Rosemary found a fan base in London, and the press followed her, keen to report on what she was doing and, of course, what she was wearing. She was fashionable, lovely and fun. They had no idea about her condition, and the Kennedys were happy to keep it that way. But just as quickly as all this had started, it was soon cut short. When war was declared in September 1939, the Kennedys left for America. Only Joe and Rosemary stayed behind in London. Rosemary was then sent to yet another boarding school, as Joe decided the pressure from the British press was getting too much for his daughter's sensitive nature. Although this could have been a disaster, it is said that Rosemary found true happiness at the new school, Belmont House. She was loved, she enjoyed her lessons, and she fitted in. Sadly, this blissful time wasn't to last either. In November 1940, Joe Sr. was forced to resign his role as ambassador. He was a known Nazi sympathiser, and therefore he simply couldn't be trusted as World War II was raging. Plus, he very publicly claimed that Britain was going to lose the war. So he had to go, and go he did, with Rosemary, back to the United States. For Rosemary, this was the worst thing that could have happened. She was ripped out of the comforting, loving world of Belmont House and was dumped right back into the competitive world of the Kennedys. This made her regress, and she became angry, lashing out at everyone. She even began to have seizures. On top of that, she would often run away from her convent school and play in the streets of Washington, D.C. by herself. This was a problem for a number of reasons, but the one that Joe and Rose focused on was kidnapping. What if someone recognised Rosemary and kidnapped her, just as the Lindbergh baby had been kidnapped in 1932? This awful kidnapping and, tragically, murder of millionaire Charles Lindbergh's son had put many wealthy American families on edge, worried that it could happen to them. The Kennedys were no exception. And then there was the other problem. If the press found out she was escaping from the convent and running around the streets, they would discover the family's big secret, the brain damage, and that would be that. It was at this point in 1941 that Joe arranged for Rosemary to undergo a new Experimental procedure, but one he hoped would make all the difference and give them a daughter to be proud of. Joe was determined for this procedure to go ahead, having been told it would heal his daughter. He was so determined he didn't even tell his wife, Rosemary's own mother, about his idea. He simply gave the green light. What was this procedure? A prefrontal lobotomy. The operation, which was risky and controversial, involved severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex by drilling into the skull and using a sharp tool to make the cuts, or, wince-inducingly, not drilling into the skull and going in through the eye socket. The day came. We don't know if Rosemary was aware of what was going to happen to her or not, but we do know that she had her head shaved and was then strapped to an operating table. This was because Rosemary was to be awake for the entire lobotomy procedure. The reason for this was not to torture the poor girl, it was so that the doctor could ensure he was severing the right connections within the brain. Rosemary had to say prayers and sing songs as he went about his brain surgery, showing him she could still function, had a memory, had speech, and so on. So, the doctor probed around in Rosemary's brain and she did as she was told. Until she didn't. Until the moment she went completely silent. The doctor immediately stopped what he was doing, knowing something was wrong. Something was wrong indeed. The lobotomy transformed 23-year-old Rosemary Kennedy from a girl with a manageable behavioural problem into a girl with the mental age of a 2-year-old. She could not walk, and she could not talk. In panic, Joe Kennedy sent Rosemary to a psychiatric hospital in upstate New York. The rest of the family was confused. Remember, they still had no idea that anything had happened. And Rosemary had never needed to be locked in an asylum before, so why now? Joseph pretended that Rosemary had gone away to study, determined to become a social worker or a teacher. And if the press bought that story, the Kennedy siblings certainly knew better. She was in a mental institution, but that was all they knew. In 1946, John Kennedy was elected to the House of Representatives and he was on the path to the White House. It was then that Joe started to worry that the press would dig up some dirt and that Rosemary's true story would be unearthed. To prevent this, and to stop JFK's ambitions being derailed, Joe Sr. had his daughter moved to another institution in Wisconsin, even further away from anyone she felt comfortable with. While all this was going on, for years now, Joe Sr. kept giving excuses as to why his children and wife could not go and visit Rosemary. All in all, it would be about 20 years before Rosemary saw any of her family again. In fact, Joe Sr. died without ever visiting her even once. Eventually, the truth came out, and the Kennedy siblings found out what had really happened to their once bubbly, fun, beautiful sister. When they knew about the lobotomy, they did everything they could for her. As president, John F. Kennedy even enacted a number of pieces of legislation that would go towards more research and help for those with similar conditions to his sister. Eunice Kennedy, the youngest sibling, set aside a fair portion of funds from the Kennedy Foundation to pay for research into mental and physical disability. She also founded Camp Shriver, a place where disabled children could go to have fun. Here, anyone with a disability could finally take part in competitive events they would otherwise be excluded from. This would eventually go on to become the Special Olympics. After Joe Sr.'s death in 1969, Rosemary gradually returned to the family. She joined her siblings on holiday and often visited other relatives. By this time there were a number of nieces and nephews to play with, and she had learned to walk again, but she never spoke. In 2005, Rosemary Kennedy died of natural causes at the age of 86. Her remaining siblings were with her. Although Rosemary was hidden away, it's amazing to think she had such a huge impact on the world, even if many people aren't aware that it was her influence that brought about many changes and that helped disabled people to become much less about their disabilities and more about the people they really are. Thank you so much for watching my video. If you enjoyed the content, click the subscribe and like button so you can receive more content like this strange story. See you next time.